It says mute. Okay.
So welcome, Pete.
Hi, Molly. Have you done the introduction?
Yes,
Okay, all right.
we're so happy to have you here with us.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And thank you to the European Forum for Restorative Justice for putting on this conference and inviting us to participate. We are very excited to offer some insights into what we have been doing in Colorado and to learn more about what's going on in Europe. We are somewhat different than Europe and the United States because we really are an incarceration nation. We have over 5% of the world's population, but we have 25% of the world's prisoners. We have, just in Colorado alone, we incarcerate people at the rate 4, 5, 6, 7 times what European countries like Germany and England and France do. So we are way over incarcerating as a matter of policy. The reasons for that are war on drugs, we are very tough on crime. It's very popular to be tough on crime. We are awash in guns in this country. We have a lot of untreated mental illness and drug addiction issues. And we have a lot of incarceration policies which keep people in prison for long periods of time. As many of you may know, incarceration creates a risk for more incarceration. People that go to prison tend to go back to prison. As a result, in this country, we have recidivism rates in the nature of 50 to 75%, meaning of people who go to prison in the United States, within 3 years, 50 to 75% of those people are back in prison. We have disproportionate minority incarceration amongst our communities of color. African Americans, Hispanic, and Latino populations are incarcerated at significantly higher rates than the white population. In addition, our criminal justice system is unconsciously expensive and continues to perpetuate trauma. My conclusion, when I was considering going into the state legislature, is that both our adult and juvenile criminal justice systems are not fulfilling the aspirations for public safety, behavioral change, victim healing, and overall justice. Despite what some people in this country believe, we cannot incarcerate and arrest ourselves out of criminal conduct. In fact, what I like to say publicly is if incarceration worked, the US would be the safest country in the world, and clearly it is not. That is what brought me to restorative justice. I had been a criminal defense lawyer and a executive with a couple of Fortune 500 companies, so that was my background. And when I learned about restorative justice, it seemed to me that it was a more holistic approach that addressed both the needs of the perpetrators of crime, the victims of crime, and the communities in which crime occurred. If we have time, we can talk about why restorative justice works. But at this point, what I think it's important to understand is that in Colorado and other states where we have implemented restorative justice legislatively, we have not set it up as the sole or exclusive remedy to address crime. We still have a prosecution-oriented system which brings charges against people, tries them, oftentimes convicts them, and or goes to plea bargain, and people end up getting sentenced. Restorative justice is an adjunct to that. Very rarely is restorative justice the sole alternative to the criminal justice system. It's a supplement and it's a tool that is also used. What we do know, both in Colorado and in other places where restorative justice has been utilized, is it has achieved extremely positive results. With meta-analysis, we have shown that restorative justice reduces recidivism, it improves victim satisfaction, it creates and promotes offender accountability and responsibility, not just in low-level offenses, but in high-level offenses, including violent crimes. So a little bit about the legislative framework that we've adopted in Colorado. I came to the legislature in 2010, and I was in a minority party in the House chamber, and I presented a bill for restorative justice as one of my first initiatives in the legislature. Unfortunately, what I found was that very few people knew anything about restorative justice. When I went around to talk to my colleagues about my restorative justice bill, I would get people's brows being furrowed and questions about what it was. I really had to figure out a way to talk to people about restorative justice and explain it in terms that were responsive to them. I'll tell you how we did that in a few minutes, but I want to talk a little bit about some of the provisions that we put into law. The starting point was a bill which created a statewide restorative justice council, which was made up of a broad group of stakeholders from throughout the criminal and juvenile justice system, from prosecutors and defense lawyers to probation and parole people, educators, people in the healthcare and behavioral health world. And the Restorative Justice Council was charged with the responsibility of providing information and training to people throughout the state of Colorado about restorative justice and how it worked. And that was all in the first bill. In addition, in one of the early bills, we had a restorative justice definition, which was principle-based. And that was important in my view, because we were concerned that people would, because funding was available, people would say that their program was a restorative justice program in order to become eligible for funding. So we put in a restorative justice definition, and I think that information is available to you. We also made restorative justice available for felonies, for misdemeanors, for petty offenses. So for all levels of crime, also in the Department of Corrections and in the Division of Youth Services, as well as in schools. But the way Colorado's system works, and in most jurisdictions around the United States, the central person who drives the system and decides what kind of charges to bring and how to address them is the prosecution. So the prosecution, the district attorneys were the people who could choose to use or not utilize restorative justice. So again, part of the legislative framework that we enacted in Colorado was to redefine the purpose of the criminal justice code and sentencing, rather than purely were we attempting to punish and rehabilitate. We also wanted to promote accountability and reparations and repairing the harm, but significantly to get people to accept accountability. So that became one of the foundational principles of Colorado's criminal justice system. And that was promoted and facilitated by utilizing restorative justice. We also, and I think this was one of the most significant provisions of the law, we set up a dedicated funding source for restorative justice programs. In fact, we provided a $1 fee on all criminal justice cases in the state of Colorado, which raised significant funds for it. We also, in one of the early bills, had a pilot program to provide a New Zealand model of pre-filing diversion for juvenile cases. a pilot program adopted by 4 jurisdictions around the state and studied and analyzed by university people to determine the results. And I am proud to say that that program was extraordinarily successful with a 95% success rate. Success defined as meaning the juveniles who participated in it, 95% were successful. They attended a victim offender dialogue. They agreed to reparations, a plan to repair the harm, and they completed the plan to repair the harm, 95% of the cases. And 3 years later, the recidivism rate was in the low range of 8%. Most juveniles in Colorado have about a 30% recidivism rate, so we cut it from 30 to under 10%. Also in our restorative justice bills, in that first 9 bills, we provided multiple opportunities for entry into restorative justice. A person could enter restorative justice early on in the process, before the plea, after the plea, through a diversion program, after sentencing, or even when they are on parole or probation. So multiple opportunities. We also included it in our Victim Rights Act so that victims became aware of their opportunities to participate in restorative justice. In the schools, our early bills provided that restorative justice should be considered as a first consideration for all types of misconduct. And again, Colorado has local school districts which decide how to conduct discipline. We cannot dictate that at the state level, so we can support and encourage and fund restorative justice programs. Another provision which we thought was very important was to have a confidentiality provision for juveniles. We haven't succeeded in getting one in for the adult cases, but anything that a juvenile says during their assessment for participation in restorative justice or in the process of a conference is confidential and cannot be used against the juvenile. We thought that was important because it provides and promotes candor amongst juveniles. And then we provided incentives for diversion. So district attorneys who utilize restorative justice can get additional funding. Most of the bills that passed in Colorado passed in legislatures that were split between Republicans and Democrats in the Senate and the House. And restorative justice, very fortunately, became nonpartisan to a great extent. And as I indicated earlier, a lot of the legislators didn't have any idea what restorative justice was. So I had a short explanation of what restorative justice was, but I would attempt to appeal to the ideologies of the people I was talking to. So, for example, in Colorado, we have quite a few libertarians who don't really believe that there's much of a role of government except for public safety. And so I talked to them about how restorative justice can remove criminal offenses from the judicial systems and allows the party to work with a private, non-governmental facilitator to work out their differences. To fiscal conservatives, I talked about cost savings. To moral conservatives, I would emphasize individual responsibility and accountability. When I spoke to progressives and advocates for social justice, I would speak about creating communities and repairing relationships. And to those in what I refer to as the law and order community, I spoke about enhanced public safety, reduced recidivism, and restitution. And to victim advocates, I talk about respect and the beginning of healing. So that's a broad overview of what we've done in Colorado with restorative justice. What I think is significant is that we have utilized restorative justice successfully, not just for the traditional low-level offenses, but for high-level offenses as well. And we have utilized restorative justice in cases where there, in fact, has been a homicide. So we've enabled a mother or father of a victim of a homicide to, if they desire to do so, meet with the offender in the Department of Corrections to see if there's a way to promote healing and repair of the harm. And some of the most successful cases that we've had in Colorado are those cases where high-level offenders have met with their victims and reached accords and understandings and enabled victims to begin healing.
Pete, I wondered if, while you're possibly waiting for some comments from Lynn, would you speak about how legislation was passed to make it so that every citizen has a right to request restorative justice in the state of Colorado? How did that happen and what does that imply?
Sure. Well, that's my aspiration, Molly. I have come to the conclusion that restorative justice is very effective and very healing for victims, but a lot of victims, one, are not aware of it, or two, when they attempt to participate in restorative justice with the responsible party, are disabled from doing so because they're refused that opportunity through the district attorney's office. So I have legislation which hopefully will be brought to the legislature next year, which will create a right for restorative justice. The bill is titled Victim Empowerment Through Restorative Justice, and it would basically require the district attorney to make victims aware of the availability of restorative justice. And then if they want it and want to participate in restorative justice, they would be entitled to it in virtually all cases. If there's a safety issue or something like that, less so available. But the idea behind it is to enable victims to become more actively involved in the case and to be empowered to participate. What we have found is so many victims stay in their place of trauma and harm and sadness, and in some cases anger, because they've never had an opportunity to heal and never had an opportunity to hear a perpetrator, a responsible party, take responsibility for what they have done. They've never had the opportunity to ask the questions in a dialogue that they would want to get answers to, and they have never had an opportunity to hear the responsible party accept responsibility for what they have done. So I'm very eager to have a victim empowerment bill submitted to the Colorado legislature. It would be a first in the nation, but I think it'll move restorative justice significantly further along to promote societal healing.
And Pete, that's something that those of us here, I have a copy of the draft legislation for people to look at, as well as the Colorado standards and practices for facilitators and training. So each person that's interested here is going to have a hard copy of that. Is there anything else you want to add about those pieces?
Yeah, I think that the standards, the operating standards for facilitators and the standards for what we call high risk facilitation. High risk are cases where there's a serious injury or a death. Low risk, for lack of a better term, are lower level offenses where there is less harm. But the Restorative Justice Council, the statewide council, brought together practitioners of restorative justice to discuss and then develop standards of protocols of best practices for use in restorative justice conferences, the same way judges and mediators are trained and are held to certain standards. Restorative justice facilitators are provided with standards to utilize to ensure that we get the best outcomes possible.
Pete, one last question for you. We still have a little bit of time. We have about 7 minutes left.
Okay.
I wanted to just ask if you could recap in a nutshell, because you have been involved in the building of the statewide coalition here in Colorado over a span of almost 2 decades, beginning with what you framed earlier to where it stands now at this moment. Could you talk just a little bit about the growth, the successes, and anything that you would recommend as possible challenges for people to look out for that you might have experienced as a former retired and former senator, as well as representative to this state of Colorado?
Sure. Thanks for that question, Molly. It's a really good question. We have learned some things. And I think one of the things that we learned is that we need to bring all stakeholders together as we develop the bill. That's what we did at the beginning. But I think the victim's voice has not been sufficiently centered, and the victims have not been sufficiently. And I think it's really important to try to provide opportunities for victims to become actively participate. Also, I mentioned that the concentration of power is in the district attorney's offices. I mean, that's just a structural thing. By empowering victims, we can hopefully move this carceral juggernaut to a more restorative and reparative one. I think another thing that's important is, as policies are developed, that they be practitioner driven. It's important to get a lot of stakeholder input, but the practitioners of restorative justice are the ones who really understand what works and how it should work. So those would be important things. And finally, we have not yet implemented adult confidentiality provisions in the adult code. We have that for plea discussions and things like that. Things that are talked about in plea discussions cannot be used against a defendant as an admission. We need to have that same sort of thing in the restorative justice for adults. Finally, though, I would like to have Lynn talk about some of the high risk, high harm cases that she has worked in, because I think it's an area that we are missing out on. She has worked with people who have committed some of the most heinous offenses and seen some of the most extraordinary outcomes. So I'm going to vacate the chair, Molly, and
Okay.
Hi, I'm Lynn Lee. I've been a restorative justice practitioner in Colorado for over 20 years. As Pete was talking about working in different areas, I'm a retired school teacher, so I've worked in schools and restorative justice and in the local courts as well. But now I do all of my work with what I call high impact dialogue. And so those are all cases where somebody has lost a loved one or a loved one has been significantly harmed. I can just describe one of those cases for you quickly and give you some information about our process. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a lady whose name is Charlotta Evans, who lost her 3-year-old in a drive-by shooting. So it was a shooting between 2 different gangs in Denver, Colorado. 2 of the gang members had been incarcerated for quite a long time before she came to me. In Colorado, those kinds of conferences need to be initiated by the victim. So Charlotta contacted me and asked me if I could help her meet with one of the young men who was in our prison system at the time. And he had gotten, as a 15-year-old, both of these young men were 15 when they were first incarcerated, and they had both gotten life without parole. So we spent, I think one of the really important pieces that I want to relate to you is that we spent a lot of time preparing them to come together. So we call it pre-conferencing here. I would go into the prison with another facilitator, and we would work with the defendant, the responsible party. So we would visit with him and prepare him to come together with her. And then we would meet with her to prepare her to meet with him. And we did that back and forth for quite a long period of time. So I think the shortest amount of time that we spend is about 4 months meeting back and forth with them. And I just finished a conference that was held in a Department of Corrections facility that I had worked on for a year and a half. So the outcome for Charletta's conference, and really my goal as a facilitator, is to help her achieve what feels important to her. So that can be different for every case, although I will say that one thing that the victims that I work with have in common is they all want to be assured that the person is not going to commit a similar crime again. So when I'm meeting with her, I'm determining what's important to her and what she wants as the outcome. Held that conference in Department of Corrections. It took 8 hours. We took a couple breaks. They had lunch together. Yeah, there's so many pieces about that I could describe, but one thing I will describe for you is at the end, she told him that she wanted to be his mom. His mom had passed away. He didn't really have any family. She wanted to be his mom and that she wanted to support him. When the conference was over, she decided that she wanted to advocate for him. So she was really instrumental in getting the laws changed nationwide. And he was released a few years ago. I can't really remember the date that he was released, but it was a number of years after their conference. The other young man that she met with a few years after she met with him is still incarcerated. But he is now out of prison. The first gentleman she met with, he was out of prison. He has a job. They see each other frequently. They go to dinner together. They have Christmas, Thanksgiving, events like that together. And they really think of each other as family. So I just want to relate that to you to help you understand the power of these conferences in the context of high impact dialogue when significant harm has occurred. So I'm going to turn it back to Pete.
Thank you, Lynn.
Thank you, Molly, for giving me the opportunity.
So that's why we do the work we do, so that people like Raymond and Charletta can go on with their lives with a heightened appreciation of each other and developing a relationship that is really powerful and emotive for both of them. So I'd be happy to answer any questions or provide any other information, Molly.
So Pete, can you just state your email that those of us here in Pamplona and anyone from the various countries within the EU who might like to get a hold of you directly? One of the things I just want to say is how much I appreciate that you truly are a people's representative, and you have been for the entire time of your service. You're one of the people who actually calls back and emails back, and you've been extraordinarily involved in helping other states here in the United States to progress legislatively and otherwise. So I just want to appreciate that about you. If you could state your email, and then if you could talk in conclusion about anything else you'd like people to know about how to break down skepticism and barriers, both legislatively as well as grassroots, and then we should conclude. Thank you, Pete.
Sure. Thank you, Molly, for those kind words. My email is PeteLeeColorado@gmail.com. It's my name, PeteLeeColorado@gmail.com. And my phone number, I don't know if you that can do that overseas, I assume 719-460-2834. And as Molly alluded to, I'm very available and interested in helping people develop restorative justice programs and policies. And we have been, I think, successful in Colorado in doing so by working collaboratively with people from all sides of the criminal justice world. Some of the first people I worked with in Colorado were the district attorneys, the prosecutors. I also worked with the public defenders, and I would send drafts of bills to both of those groups. I would work with children's advocates. The first bill that I proposed was a juvenile restorative justice bill, and thus we involved juveniles in Colorado and in many other places. What juvenile justice advocates would say is the best thing to do with juveniles in the criminal justice system is to get them out of the criminal justice system, to develop, give them the opportunity to develop relationships and to help repair the harm outside of the criminal justice system. So again, I worked a lot with stakeholders, and I think that's really the key, is getting people to understand restorative justice and to work collaboratively to implement it. I think the biggest barrier is that people tend to want to do things the way they've always done them. Prosecutors have learned to prosecute and incarcerate, and to get them to look at ways of addressing offenses differently is hard to do. And the most successful thing that we have done is to actually have prosecutors come into restorative justice conferences that are taking place. They can come in as community members and actively participate, but it's a learning process to see how victims, survivors, and responsible parties and community members can talk about offenses collaboratively, collectively, and responsibly. And to see what happens in a conference goes a long way towards breaking down barriers and getting people to understand how restorative justice really works. So that's those are my thoughts about restorative justice and how to get it implemented.
Thank you so much, Pete. I think we are at time. Really appreciate you and Lynn today being with us all the way from Colorado. We're sitting here in Pamplona and can't wait to connect you and Lynn with anybody who has interest in furthering an inquiry about the progress made here over the last 20 years in Colorado. So thank you again for being with us this morning.
Our pleasure. I regret that we can't be there with you in person, but hopefully some point we'll be able to take a trip to Spain and travel to Pamplona and maybe visit with some of the people around the European Union and work with you to help improve the systems that we're working with. So thanks very much, Molly, and thank you to the restorative justice people in the European Union. Have a
Yeah,
great day, great conference.
Thank you, Pete, and thank you to the EFRJ for hosting us today.